Certainly, certainly good to have the opportunity again this evening to complete this series of lessons on the unanswered questions of science. And we've looked at several different areas and the universe from the field of biology and from tonight the field of geology, the fossil record. And while there's without a doubt have not covered everything that could be said or maybe should be said, certainly I've enjoyed the willingness of the congregation to put up with me and the kind words that you've offered after each lesson. Of course, we will continue somewhat of this as I'll be teaching the adult Bible class during the vacation Bible school, and we'll look at the 6 days of creation. Well, there were 7 days in creation. And so we'll take a look at those and look at some additional science that supports those types of things. Tonight's lessons in geology or from geology is going to deal with fossils, and I think I've finally reached the qualifications to present this lesson. Among the Board of Education members, I'm the oldest, and so they say I'm older than dirt. So, I thought that works. And then for my brothers, I've always been told I was dumber than a box of rocks. So I guess maybe I am qualified to talk about dirt and rocks, but I do have a basement full of rocks, or certainly several boxes, as I have been interested in fossils for much of my time here on Earth. And so we'll look at as quickly as possible, and there's an awful lot of material. We're going to be looking at some of the words of the evolutionist, because as a creationist, as somebody who believes that God's Word says exactly what He intended for us to know, and that somehow all of the things of science do fit into that particular framework. Again, I don't have all the answers. God didn't supply me all of the answers of science that I would like to have to be able to understand myself and then be able to share with other people. But certainly when we look at the question of fossils, the Bible doesn't say a whole lot. It's pretty quiet about the whole question of fossils, but we can look into the book of Genesis and see some of the conditions that would have been necessary to produce fossils. And of course this comes from the Genesis flood, and all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle and of the beasts and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, and all that was in the dry land died. And so we see that during this period of time that we'll call the flood, or that is called the flood, that there was a huge amount of death. And as we go through this lesson and develop these ideas, we're going to see that without a doubt the major condition necessary to produce vast numbers of fossils is exactly what Genesis chapter 7 talks about. Talks about the flood that destroyed everything that that breathed air into nostrils. And so, of course, it would have killed many other things. But again, so we know that can be an answer. Now, does that explain everything? Absolutely not, because there are challenges on both sides of this issue for the creationist and for those individuals of evolution. So let's look at really quickly, how do fossils form? There are lots of different types of fossils. An animal dies, and then it has to be rapidly buried in sediment of some sort. It has to be gotten away from oxygen. Its skeleton then may settle to the bottom of a stream, a river, a seafloor, and then be buried by sand or mud, volcanic ash. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens produced some fossils, including some human fossils, because there were a couple individuals that were killed and buried by the volcanic ash of the explosion of Mount St. Helens, and or then, of course, tree sap and amber. And most of the slides that I'll have tonight, and the ones that are of fossils, those are ones in my collection. I haven't been able to collect them all, but I have them all in my collection. For example, this one is an example of amber, and you may not be able to see from back there, but in this small block of amber that's about an inch by a half an inch, there are more than 50 termites. And you can see one right here, the abdomen one, there's the head of one and the abdomen. And these termites were trapped in this tree sap as it flowed down onto, from a pine tree, and of course then encased them and buried them, and they are fossils. So you can have many different types of things that are fossils. You can see a brachiopod shell here that was collected from up on top of the mountain when we were deer hunting on top of Laurel Mountain up there, and that of course is a shell fish type animal. So we have to get the animals, whatever it is, very quickly away from the oxygen. We know that an animal that dies out along the road isn't going to become a fossil. It's going to die and it's going to rot and it's going to decay and be gone unless something eats it. An animal drags it off the road and eats it. And so we can see that the need to get rid of these, to get these living things away from oxygen is very important. The sediment then will turn to over time, and that period of time isn't very long. We've actually, again, 1980, and the fossils of trees and of animals and people that were covered up by that volcanic ash, they have fossilized and have become mineralized. And so it's important that particular process, again, the rock will develop and form. The bones and or hard material, for example, that shell was not a bone. It had a calcium carbonate shell structure, just like all shellfish do. And it left an impression in the sand, and then, of course, the shell would have dissolved away. And in many cases, that will happen, and it would just leave an imprint like that one did. Or in many cases, as some of my dinosaur fossil, the bones themselves will become mineralized and then remain in the rocks. And so eventually the rock layers have to be exposed due to erosion, and we see the remains, whatever it happens to be, an imprint, an actual bone. It can be a trail or a track. It can even be their droppings, their poo, and the corpullites and that's actually a fairly big study in the fossil world. And so some of the fossils, again, and I'm probably the only person, I know I'm the only person in Barber County, I think. These are two of my fossils that, again, I'm just crazy enough, and Norma will indulge me occasionally, to buy fossils and pay money for them. These are from China, and this is a Ketchiosaur. That is a dinosaur. It was, an aquatic dinosaur, and this is the dinosaur egg that I purchased, Segnosaur egg, and I'm looking for somebody. If you know somebody that has an x-ray machine, I would like to x-ray this, get this egg x-rayed, so see if the entire embryo is inside of that. The value of a dinosaur egg goes up about tenfold if it's got the embryo inside. So I'm looking for somebody that's crazy enough to stick a rock in their x-ray machine, but we'll see. And so I have plenty of fossils, and there are still some fossils I'm looking to acquire, and I'll mention that later on. Well, some of the predictions of the evolutionary model, and I think it's important that we understand what they have predicted. Number one, evolution predicts that the lowest level of rocks, the supposedly oldest, and as I refer to the oldest layers of rocks, we're going to be talking about the geologic time periods of 4.5 billion years, but it would be the rocks that are at the lowest level, generally, but those rocks would have the simplest animals. They would have the remains of the animals that so-called evolved early during the evolutionary periods of life. And so that would be the first feature. Then as you move up, that there would be a gradual change, and there would be new organisms that would be seen, new living things, new fossils that were evidence or new living things that were evidenced by the fossils that they left behind. And of course, increasing in an orderly process, and this is called the transition trunk, and we'll talk a little bit more about transition fossils in a moment. And then as you get further up in the rock layers, you would have the divergent forms, and that simply means evolution has continued to develop, and you get more and more ever-increasing complexity, numbers of diversity of organisms, the more highly evolved, and those would be further up in the geologic strata, the geologic layers, or the rock layers, as that's all that means. And so those are the predictions of the evolutionary model. And of course, the idea is that the rock layers supposedly show the entire history of the world. We'll see at the end of tonight's lesson that's not necessarily the case. There is not one location, and I'll say this up front in case I have to hurry through the end, but there's not one location in the entire earth where all of the supposed 4.5 billion years of rock layers appear. There is none, period, end of discussion. There'll be a few here, there'll be a few here, there'll be a few here, and they want to mismatch and put them together and make the picture that they want from those rock layers. But the promise of the evolution is that there are going to be no gaps in the fossils from a single cell to a multicellular organism like the marine invertebrates, that from marine invertebrates to fish, there will be a very clear pattern, there will be a very clear development, and then of course from the invertebrates up to the more complex organisms that we'll see. It's called the Cambrian explosion, and we'll look at that in a minute. This is of course what the evolutionary biologist, it'll be in the textbooks, it'll be in the museums, Carnegie, Smithsonian, the New York Museum of Natural History, etc., the evolutionary tree of life. And they present this, and of course up here is humans, over here are the plants and animals. If you go down far enough, we are related to the trees, according to the evolutionists. We had a common ancestor with the plants, and of course a common ancestor with the other primates, and so on down the tree of life. But one of the quotes that I'll be providing from an evolutionist said, and keep this in mind, we have evidence here and here and here at the very nodes, the ends. We have evidence for those things, but when it comes to these connections and these links, the evidence is not there. So the evolutionary tree of life. Charles Darwin in 1850 wrote his book called Evolution, The Origin of Species, dealing with, for the first time, the idea of evolution. This is from the first edition of that book, page 280. Why then is not every geologic formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against my theory. Well, he said, we've only discovered about 20% of the fossils. We've only looked at about 20% of the world's fossil record. And when we finally discover those, that's going to fill in the gaps. Well, now we're at about 85% discovery of fossils and examination, and we haven't gotten any closer. He also said later on, by the theory of natural selection, all living species have been connected with the parent species of each genus. And these parent species, now generally extinct, have in their turn been similarly connected with more ancient species, and so on backwards, always conveying to the common ancestor. And that emphasis is mine. Keep that in mind. They always say that everything had a common ancestor of each great class, so that the number of intermediate and transition links between all living and extinct species must have been inconceivably great. And he said that in, again, The Origin of Species, page 281 and 282. And so Darwin expected there to be these intermediate, these links between. Another evolutionary site said the fossil record gives no clue that any basic type of animal has ever changed into another basic type of animal. For no undisputed chain of in-between forms has ever been discovered. And so this is the state of things. Fossils have been promised to prove something, and they have fallen well short. The evolutionary biologist Henry Gee, it is effectively impossible to link fossils into chains of cause and effect in any valid way. He concludes to take a line of fossils and claim that they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story, amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. And so the effort to show these links, to show that tree of life in the fossil record is basically, according to this evolutionary biologist, a bedtime story. It's entertaining, but there's no science to back it up. And so the actual fossil record, and by the way, this is a trilobite, if you didn't know what a trilobite was. I will probably mention trilobites at some point in the PBS. So that's what one looks like, okay, if I don't put him back on the screen later. So the oldest rocks, again, then as we sort of tie that back together, have very few fossils, and you would expect them to be very simple, very non-complex, in other words, the invertebrates. And then as we go up, but what they have found is that in the actual fossils, you have very limited fossils in the oldest layers of rock. But then you come to a layer called the Cambrian explosion, or the Cambrian period, about 500, and again, their dates, 550 million years ago. The Earth's less than 10,000 years old, according to the Bible. Okay, we'll just state that up front. But at about 550 million years in the fossil record, there is a fossil explosion. The Big Bang of biology, it's called. Remember, there was a Big Bang of evolution that brought everything into existence. Well, the Big Bang of biology is when all living things just all of a sudden appear in the fossil record. Every phyla of every living thing is found fully formed. And this is what this is how they show the Big Bang of biology. This, of course, is from ancient times up through the present. This is the number of species, the number of phylums, kingdom, phylum, class, order. In other words, the classification of living things. The phylum would include the major groups of organisms, mammals, et cetera, okay? The birds, the aves, and so on. But you can see that in the early time periods, before 530 million years ago, the red line represents the number of living things that have been fossilized, that we see in the fossil record. Virtually no fossils in those earliest of rock layers. And then all of a sudden, in basically what is called an instant in geologic time, if you're talking about 4.5 billion years, about 10 million years, you have virtually every known species, well, at a period of 10 million years, excuse me, you have a jump of virtually every known species, and including many that have went extinct. And so from that time, the number of living species and the number of living phyla has dropped. And so the fossil record shows some great diversity, some great problems for the evolutionary model. It doesn't very well fit what the fossil record actually shows. And there are a few places in the world, in China, in Canada, where the Cambrian explosion, the fossils of the Cambrian period, and they yield some of the most incredible fossils, and it's of every known species. One of the authors said this: most of the animal groups that have been represented, that are represented in the fossil record, first appear fully formed. Remember, evolution is going to be half this. We'll talk about Randy's a little bit. Randy's half this and half that. There ought to be something out there, right, Randy? Half this and half that. Right now we should be able to find. But they appear in the fossil record fully formed and identifiable as to their phylum in the Cambrian some 550 million years ago. These include such anatomically complex, distinctive types such as trilobites, echinoderms, brachiopods, mollusks, and chordates. Chordates are the animals with backbones. The fossil record is therefore of no help with respect to the origin and early diversification of the various animal phyla. Basically, the fossil record doesn't help explain anything about how animals, how living things got here. It's just, especially whenever you see them and they're fully formed the first time. Stephen Jay Gould, who was one of the world's foremost atheists, he's no longer an atheist, I'm sorry to say. And the reason he's not an atheist any longer is he's dead. He passed away. He was the chair of biology at Harvard, Cambridge University, and strong atheist, evolutionist to the T. He said this: the fossil record with its abrupt transition offers no support for gradual change. All paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. That's this half that and half that type things. Transition between major groups are characteristically abrupt. That means they're not there. It's like, here's one thing, and all of a sudden, there's the next one with no connections in between. And so even Stephen Jay Gould himself, the world's most preeminent evolutionist during his day, nowadays it's Richard Dawkins at Harvard, Oxford, excuse me, has taken that job over. Evolutionary anthropologist Jeffrey Schwartz said this: "We are still in the dark about the origin of most major groups of organisms. They appear in the fossil record, full-blown and raring to go, in contradiction to Darwin's depiction of evolution as resulting from the gradual accumulation of countless infinitesimal minute variations. This poses a major challenge to Darwinian evolution, including the view that all animals are related through a common ancestry." Folks, these aren't creationists. These are people that believe the Bible. And they're saying exactly what creationists have been saying. You know, God created everything instantaneously. There's no half this, half that. When God created them, He created them. Now, how they ended up in the ground as fossils, again, that's a little less, less clear. And like I said, I hold the flood model as being the best way that we get huge numbers of fossils. Well, what about these transition fossils then between links? And we'll look at one or two examples in just a moment. The rarity, and again, this is Stephen Jay Gould, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persist as the trade secret of paleontology. They don't want you to know this. They don't want to tell this. They don't want to publish this in the major scientific magazine, major scientific publications, because they're not proud of it, because they need that people to believe that. Yeah, fossils prove evolution. The evolutionary tree that adorns our textbooks, and that's the one we had up a few minutes ago, have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference. That means they made it up. We're just making up that, yeah, this had to be connected to that, well, kind of looks like that. Humans kind of look like the other primates, the monkeys, chimpanzees, gorillas, the gibbons, etc., etc. But it's that the rest of that is inference. However reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. And so there is one of the world's premier evolutionists saying we can't prove anything by the fossils. We are simply guessing. Well, here's one of the modern transitions from one organism to another that is found. I'm sure I could go to the Smithsonian in Washington, Museum of Natural History there, and we would see this portrayed. It's in the textbooks. It's in it used to be encyclopedias, not anymore since they don't have encyclopedias. But if you did a search on the internet, how's that? If you Googled transition fossils, you would get the transitions of the whale. How did a whale come about? Now you have to remember that a whale is a mammal that was on land, that came out of the water. Mammals came out of the water the first time whenever a fish decided it was going to crawl up on the land and become an amphibian, a salamander. Where's Alana? Alana's had her salamander here last week at church. Brought her salamander to church. But, so it came out, became a mammal, and then for some reason the whales decided to go back. And here is, according to the evolutionists, the first animal, land animal, that started in that direction to becoming a whale again. Well, then it went to this one, and then this one, and this one. Well, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, and we have modern whale skeletons. They have 4 organisms that have characteristics that, well, look, okay, up here in the whale, there's a couple tiny bones. Here, that's the leftover of the hind leg. See, can't you see that? And if you can't, what's wrong with you? Well, you got some intelligence. That's what's wrong with you. That's the entirety of their transition between a land-dwelling creature and a whale, like the sperm whale or the blue whale. There's virtually nothing there. And even that, the question of whether this ever evolved into that cannot be established by any scientific method or means. Well, while Darwinian evolution has always predicted that transitional forms would one day be found, the current rage in evolutionary circles, because they can't show this gradual change, is the concept of rapid evolution or punctuated equilibrium. This proposes that small, isolated portions of a large population evolved rapidly and left no fossils. But the question is, where's the evidence that they even evolved at all? And so punctuated equilibrium is one of the methods that evolutionists try to use to explain away the lack of transition fossils, the lack of this land-dwelling creature that changed over periods of time and then finally ended up becoming the whale with millions of intermediate tiny steps in that evolutionary change. And so they say, well, maybe they didn't happen. Maybe there was a sudden jump. And because that's what we see in the fossil record. In the rock layers of the earth, we don't see the gradual. We see these quick jumps from one organism to another, and they call that punctuated equilibrium or rapid evolution. Well, let's look at the facts. If we listed all the facts of fossils, number one, fossils always appear in the fossil record, in the rock layers, suddenly. It's like, there they are, just bang, they're there. After their first appearance, they stay the same. It's called stasis. That means they don't change over long periods of time, and there'll be multiple layers. And so the idea of it's staying exactly what it is. Complexity, that means these living things are complex. The first time a trilobite appears, it has some of the most complex eyes that have ever been imagined in the animal kingdom. They're almost as complex as the modern insects, and yet they just appear instantly in the fossil record. And that the trilobite eyes has given great deals of problems for evolution. So at the first appearance, they showed advanced complexity. They are complex fossils the first time they see. Normally we see extinction, things going out of existence rather than new things coming into existence by evolution. No transition between the phyla, between the major groups of living things. All major phyla are represented at the first levels of the fossils. And so invertebrates, then you have in the same layer, you have those animals that have backbones. An invertebrate means an animal without a backbone. Then you have vertebrates in the same layer. And so that presents a problem. Most fossils are marine invertebrates. Like that shellfish I showed you, virtually the vast majority, I think it's like 87, 88, 89% of all fossils that are known to mankind today are marine invertebrates. That means they lived in the ocean. Well, imagine how on top of the mountain, top of Laurel Mountain, and the top of Mount Everest, the highest mountain above sea level, they find marine fossils. They find shellfish, 29,000 feet above sea level. I wonder why. Wait a minute. How deep was the flood? 15 cubits above the highest mountain. All right, go figure. There was an ocean there. There was an ocean everywhere. And so, and of course, that also explains sedimentary rocks, but that's another lesson in geology I don't have time to get into tonight. And then there are, all the fossils show evidence of a violent death. From the Green River Formation, I've got lots of fish fossils, and when you find fish fossils that there'll be, in some of the cases, rocks as big as that screen, and there'll be hundreds of fish fossilized on that. The biggest one, I think I've got 3 fish on it. The piece of rock that I've got only has 3 fish on it. But, they exhibit violent deaths. They had to be buried very, very quickly. It wasn't just one here and one there. There was the entire ecosystem was wiped out. And then fossils occur in vast fossil graveyards. Places like the Green River Formation in southern Wyoming, and it's a great place if you're into fossils, which I spent my 40th birthday perched up on the side of the Rocky Mountains collecting fossils, all right, from the Green River Formation. Packed out as many as I could, all right. It's about a 1.5 mile hike out of the mountains back to the road where I told Norma she could pick me up at a certain time. But the Green River Formation, the Dinosaur National Monument in Jensen, Utah, they are vast fossil graveyards. Kansas has several graveyards. The La Brea tar pits in California. Basically, just all kinds of animals ended up in that fossil graveyard. And so that's the evidence that we actually see. Sudden appearance. Everything stays the same. Complexity at the beginning. Extension, not evolution, and so on down the line. Well, let's look at a couple other problems for fossils as time's getting away on us. There's something when we study fossils and when they look at fossils called polystratic fossils. Poly meaning many, strata meaning layers, okay? If you have a cake that has multiple layers, those are strata, so to speak. Okay? This is, well, it's a tree. It's a tree trunk. It's a tree, the base of a tree. And it's spread over, some of them, 30 feet of rock layers. It's standing upright in the rock layers and exposed. Now think about it. This is a sort of a, the question is that Mount St. Helens did a lot of this as a matter of fact, and now they're actually scuba diving in the Spirit Lake at Mount St. Helens and going down and digging up the fossils of these trees that are now have settled down in this fashion, in this up and down fashion. Their root balls were heavier, they settled to the bottom, and then were covered up by successive layers of volcanic ash and sediment that washed into Spirit Lake, and you have they're polystratic layers or fossils that cover several layers. But now, in the evolutionary terms, you have to remember that an evolutionist believes that it takes maybe 100 million years to develop 1 inch of rock. For that sediment to settle, finally turns to rock, and then over another 100 million years you get another inch of sediment. Now imagine a tree that's 30 feet long standing there maybe 200-300 million years while it's completely buried by the fossil layer, or by the rock layers. That isn't going to happen. We know what happens if a tree falls out in the woods, it rots up, the animals, termites get in it, and it's going to be gone very quickly. So the polystratic fossils present great problems for evolutionists. It's difficult for them to explain a method by which this could occur. Well, let's look at the problem of living fossils, and this I've got an entire lesson, an hour long on this one, but we'll look at just a couple examples. Not a scientific term per se, living fossils, but there's no consensus, there's no consensus on the formal definition. But for the purpose of this lesson, we're going to define a living fossil as an ancient species, one that hasn't gone extinct, has not produced or radiated into many other species, and has remained relatively unchanged over the course of a long period of time, according to evolutionists. Again, if you're a creationist and God created everything less than 10,000 years ago, then it's not all that long ago. But for the evolutionists, in many cases, it's hundreds and multiple hundreds of millions of years of evolution that these things haven't changed. Well, here's one example. This is a ginkgo. There is the modern tree, and I know they live in West Virginia. I know of two in Buchanan, where I used to play golf. There's 2 ginkgo trees over at the old golf course. But you can see the ginkgo leaf in a fossil 270 million years. This rock layer that fossil is found in, that ginkgo leaf is found in, was dated at 280 million years. There has been zero change. Zero. Hasn't changed at all in 200 million years of evolution. If all living things go through this gradual process of change due to mutation, then what's wrong with these guys? Roger Shipman I'm going to get Roger Shipman back there. He brought this fossil to me and showed it. This is from the Sago coal mine in Upshur County. I believe it's your brother-in-law? Yeah. Brother-in-law that worked in the mine and found this fossil of a flower. The rock layer that, of course, the coal mine is in is dated to the Pennsylvanian era or age, about 290 million years ago. That rock layer, those coal layers formed. Well, again, remember the formation of fossils. We talked about bones and hard shells, and hard parts are the things that most normally became fossils. Well, I got news for you. A flower doesn't have many bones. And doesn't have many hard parts. Well, it doesn't have any hard parts from that standpoint. But when you look at this particular fossil, and again, most of these are from my collection. Most of the pictures of fossils are from my collection. I still hope to get this one into my collection if I have to buy it or whatever is necessary. This is an incredible fossil because it's a modern oxeye daisy. And I took that picture out in my front yard a couple years ago with the water drops. But daisies, back up, there is no difference between those two organisms. 290 million years of evolution, and the oxeye daisy has not changed one bit. Well, we can look at the ant, Proverbs 6:6. Solomon said, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise." Well, army ants, this quote from evolutionist, army ants, as voracious as ever, have defied evolution for 100 million years, Cornell entomologist finds. Using fossil data and the tools of a genetics detective, a Cornell University entomologist has discovered that these ants come from the same ancestor because since the reign of the dinosaurs about 100 million years ago, army ants, in essence, have not changed a bit. So no evolution in army ants, no evolution in the oxeye daisy, no evolution in the ginkgo, no evolution in trilobites. And I could list, like I said, I've got, probably hundreds of these in that other lesson. And they're all unchanged over supposedly millions of years of evolution. Well, so the question is, these fossils are, many of them are missing. The transitions are missing entirely. They're just not there. There are no undisputed transitional links in the fossil record that have been put forth. The smooth changes between one creature to another are entirely missing. Rather, fossils make quick jumps between one form and one goes extinct, and all of a sudden another one is seen in the fossil record. And then this idea of living fossils, of the living things that simply haven't gone extinct. And the reason for that is staggering to evolutionists. They used to say that the coelacanth, which is a big fish, about 5 feet long, lives in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Madagascar. They used to say, and it lives down very deep, like 4,000 feet. They used to say, well, it was protected from the environmental changes that would cause the mutations that would produce the evolution, and that's why it didn't change. They've never tried to explain the oxeye daisy. They've never tried to explain the ginkgo tree. They've never tried to explain the army ants and the termites and so on and so on and so on. Because that termite that I showed you at the very beginning, I used to collect termites out of logs out of my house, take them in for my students, and the students would experiment with those termites. If you want to hear about those experiments, those are some weird things that you can do with termites. Termites love ink pens. Ask me how after church. All right? It freaks students out. It really does. And it probably will freak most everybody out. Well, then the evidence of these fossil graveyards. I mentioned the Dinosaur National Monument in Jensen, Utah. They have there what's called the fossil wall. And this wall is probably twice as long as the walls of our building. So it's huge and probably twice as high as the ceiling. And in that fossil wall are the bones of at least 17 different species of dinosaurs. Norma and Brian and I had the opportunity to go there some years ago. We went out to Sheridan, Wyoming for a mission trip and door knocking campaign, and to teach a series of lessons for the church at Sheridan, Wyoming. Spent some time traveling around, went to Jensen, Utah. I asked one of the tour guides, I said, because in one area you'll see the neck of a dinosaur, and then over here will be the head. Maybe back up here is one of its legs, and another leg will be over here somewhere. They're not laying there in those nice, pretty forms that we normally think of when we think of dinosaur fossils. And I said, how did they all get jumbled up like this? And with a very straight face said, well, they were obviously drowned in a flood, and were floating and started decomposing, and pieces started falling off and being buried. And I thought, well, thank you. You just proved the scientific evidence for the flood of Noah. Of course, his answer, and he went on to say, well, it was probably a regional flooded river or something that came in and caught these dinosaurs, and they all floated along and rotted, and then pieces fell off and then were covered and buried. And of course, they will not, no matter what evidence shows itself. And the Dinosaur National Monument, the fossil wall there certainly proves, would be exactly what we'd expect if dinosaurs, which breathed air in their nostrils, were all drowned in a flood, were floating in the ocean of the world when the world was covered by water, and then the pieces started falling off and dropping down and being buried by mud. So example of a catastrophic situation that produced fossils. Well, one more thing, and the lesson will be yours. You know, at the beginning of the lesson, we talked about the rock layers and not showing the entire history of the earth. This quote deals with the layers of the Grand Canyon. Many of us have been to the Grand Canyon, seen it's a marvelous sight to see a mile down into the rock layers and all these hundreds of rock layers. The size of the great unconformity, which is how they describe missing layers, also differs across the canyon. With a smaller gap to the east, Peake says at its smallest, the gap covers about 250 million years. At its largest, 1.2 billion years of rock is missing. Now, basically, folks, what that means is, and another quote says, for critical periods of canyon formation, the geological record is entirely missing. The rocks and fossils the researchers need in order to tell a cogent story have either washed away or been buried, presumably, in places not yet discovered. I used this quote at Oxford University, and there was no one in that group of 30 or 40 evolutionists challenged me. They don't know where the rock layers are. They don't know where the sediment is. They don't even know where the sand that eroded, that came from the Grand Canyon that eroded out, it's missing. All of that rock, all of that sand that would have been eroded by the Colorado River has never been found. They have no idea where it is. And besides that, they're missing huge numbers of layers, about 1.2 billion years. Remember, the Earth's only 4.5 billion years old, according to their timetable. And yet, the Grand Canyon, missing a bunch down here, missing a bunch down here, where are 251 million years? But whenever you look at the Grand Canyon layers, they want you to believe that that's the entire Earth's history. There is a record of all the layers, going all the way back in time, and each one of those layers took so many hundreds of million years to form, and that's the record. Well, we need Paul Harvey to tell us the rest of the story, because we're not getting the story from them, because about 1/4 or better of the history of the Earth is not present in the Grand Canyon, which is the deepest canyon as far as number of layers of rocks in the world. And so, well, how do they know that they're not there? Well, they find another layer 4,000 miles away, and it has fossils in it that they say, well, those evolved at about this time, and so they must have been in that period right there. But somehow those rock layers got washed away in the Grand Canyon, and so that's why we don't see those. They dance around so much to try to keep their story afloat. Again, it becomes a bedtime story. It basically is a fairy tale that they have produced in order to explain evolution, explain the existence of life, and explain the age of the Earth using the rock layers and so on. Well, one last biblical quote, and then the lesson will be yours. If we go to 2 Peter chapter 3, for this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and into water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. 2 Peter 3, 5 through 6. And what better conditions to form fossils than in a worldwide flood that killed everything that breathed there that was not on the ark. If it wasn't on the ark, it died. It died, it sunk, it was buried. It had to be. Where else is it going to go? All right? Would there have been huge amounts of sedimentation? Well, the fountains of the great deep broke open. And you can imagine the amount of sediment, amount of mud that would have been washed around during that year that the flood occurred and the waters covered the earth. And so certainly, does that explain all the fossils? Am I saying that? Absolutely not, because it just, God didn't expect, God didn't have the Bible, inspire the Bible to tell me exactly how each of those fossils developed. I have to believe by faith. Well, the question comes in, when it comes to spiritual matter, when it comes to things that are the most important, there are no unanswered questions with God. He's given us what we need. God planned every living thing. Now, did he plant the fossils? Some individuals will say that. Of course, his plan for salvation includes to hear, believe, repent, confess and to be baptized. You have to remember that evolutionists want us to believe that this is how man came about. From a lower form of life, from a common ancestor with, that led back to the other primates, the gorillas and the chimpanzees. No, humans didn't evolve from the chimpanzees. That's not what Darwin said, nor any other evolution. They said we have a common ancestor. Well, that simply isn't the case because, of course, God created fully formed Adam and Eve and created them as adults. Well, that's another story in the whole affair. He created chickens, not an egg. And so tonight, if you've never obeyed the gospel, if you've never obeyed God's plan of salvation, of course, while this lesson hasn't primarily been spiritual in nature, dealing with the gospel of Christ and the good news, but it certainly supports what God has told us about how He created things, how things would have died, how every living thing would have died, and disproves the evolutionary idea that man is just another animal. So tonight, if you have need of the gospel plan of salvation, if you have never become a Christian, never followed the plan of salvation as it's been given to us for our salvation, we can take care of that tonight. If you've done that and you've allowed the evolutionary ideas and the things that the world puts out there, well, I've got a PhD, so I know, the answers to this. No, they don't. They're guessing, and they're making up things as they go. So if this evening you need to respond to the gospel in any way, we'd encourage you to come while we stand and sing the song selected.